Adrian Forty, professor at the Bartlett. When I say everyone must know him, I heard him introduced recently in Nanjing, in China, where the professor who was introducing him said he's kind of known to be in China known as God. So popular is the book Text and Buildings. So we have God to come and speak on dissecting the cadaver. Okay, Adrian, thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. This is a very pragmatic talk. I'm not going to offer you any thoughts about the nature of truth, the past, time, or any of the other big questions. Every year, at the start of every academic year, I find myself standing in front of an audience of 150 or so new students of architecture and planning, to whom I present a course on the history of architecture and cities. And I feel I have to offer them some explanation as to why they are having a history course. I say to them, look, you're young people, you've come here to make new things. Why should you be concerned with the past? And I go on to say, surely it's only declining civilizations that become obsessed with their past. Memories, histories of the past are really only the last refuge of those who are getting old, who have nothing else to look forward to. But you, I say, you've come here, you're young, you have everything to look forward to, so why should you possibly be concerned with what has happened before in the world of architecture and cities? Why should it be of any concern to you at all? And I mean, I find this a very difficult question, and one which I've never really satisfied myself as to the answer to. But because of the situation I find myself in, I feel I have to give some kind of an answer. And there seem to me to be several sorts of answers that one could give. The one that I give is to do with the nature of the subject that we are concerned with buildings and cities. And I think it's useful to think perhaps about how the study of architecture and of cities differs from some other disciplines. And we've, in fact, in Reinhold's talk already this morning, been thinking a bit about that, about the relationship between architecture and science, architecture and the law. And I'm going to kind of prolong this analogy a little further. If you take some disciplines like, say, engineering or economics, the knowledge in those fields consists of a body of theory which people learn and which they learn how to apply in given situations. And the same would be true of law under a constitutional legal system. Architecture and building are not like that. The knowledge in architecture and building consists in the buildings and cities that there are. This is not to say that we can't have theories about buildings and cities. We do. But ultimately, the test of all those theories is what is actually there. If you want to know what a wall is, if you want to know what an opening is, you have to look, in a sense, at all walls and all openings. A civil engineer, a structural engineer, can give you a theoretical description of a wall or an opening, but as an architect, to know what a wall or an opening is, you need to look at walls and openings. The knowledge is in the objects. This seems to me to put architecture apart from those more theoretically based disciplines like suggested engineering and economics and possibly law. On the other hand, it makes architecture more like some other disciplines, and the one that I'm going to think about is medicine. Because in medicine, knowledge is ultimately knowledge of the body. We have theories about how the body works, but those theories are only any good if they correspond to the clinician's actual knowledge and experience of the body as we are presented with it. The knowledge is in the body. It's there. And whether it's the physiognomy or whether it's the processes of the body, those are the things to which everything has to always refer back, whether it's pathology, whatever. So let's take this analogy of medicine and ask, well, what happens in a medical student's education? Well, the first thing that you do if you're a medical student is that you're presented with a dead body, a cadaver, and you have to dissect it. And you spend your first 3 months taking it apart, slowly, methodically, and recording everything that you see. And that is your initial introduction into the knowledge that is medicine. So obviously it doesn't stop there, but that's the beginning of it. Now, it seems to me that there is some kind of parallel process, some kind of equivalent that is needed for the student of architecture and of cities. They too need to know what the material on which they're operating is, even if they're going to set off and very soon start making new things. So how does one deal with this? What could one do? Well, in one way, you'd say that the best possible thing to do would be to kind of equip everyone with, a year's airfare to fly wherever in the world and travel the world and go on some kind of grand tour in which, they see as much as is possible in a year's time, in the space of a year, maybe. That would be one solution to it. However, there are certain drawbacks to that as a way of presenting an education. I mean, you give them an itinerary, you give them instructions as to what they were to go and look at and so on. But I'm not sure it would really work. And the reason why I think it would work is because it's all very well going to something, but what do you see when you get there? And we've probably all had the experience of going to a supposedly great work of architecture and finding that when we get there, we think, well, why have I come? What's this all about? What's in it? And you go away kind of puzzled, and you write that off and think, oh, well, perhaps it's not so great after all. The problem is that we don't have any innate natural ability to read buildings and cities. Buildings and cities are notoriously resistant to understanding. They don't give up their meanings easily. And certainly for somebody arriving in a school of architecture at the age of 18, however bright and well educated they might be, I wouldn't expect them to have the means to make sense of what they were seeing, even if I got them to go and see all these works around the world. So there seems to me a need that we have to provide, which is, in a sense, to give people the apparatus with which to make sense of what they see. Seeing is difficult, and this capacity to see and to realize that buildings can carry thoughts is something which people have to acquire a skill at interpreting. And essentially what I see a history course as doing is as providing some means in order to make sense of what people are seeing. Now, how does one do that? Well, there are many possibilities, and I'll say a little bit about it. But perhaps at this point I should unload one of my personal obsessions, which is the fact that students of architecture seem to be so reluctant to leave their place of study and to go out and look at anything. You know, the students at the AA, the students at the Bartlett are studying in London, which is a city which is, you know, reasonably well stocked with some quite interesting things to look at. How many of them has the average student of architecture been to look at? Not very many, I suspect. How many students of the AA have made the journey to see St George's Bloomsbury, say? It's a mere 4 minutes walk, possibly, from here. I'd hazard it's a fairly low percentage. For some reason or other, there's this kind of agoraphobia that sets in amongst students of architecture, in which they cling to their laptops, to their place in the studio, and have a kind of terror of going out and seeing anything. So for me, one of the main kind of challenges of teaching in the School of Architecture is actually to get people out of the School of Architecture and to confront solid matter out there. And this is maybe a rather low ambition, but actually I feel if I've achieved this, we've got somewhere. So that's a kind of aside in a way. It is my kind of belief that, you know, part of the task of a history course is to encourage people to kind of feel relaxed about engaging with actual buildings and cities, and to give them the confidence that they feel that they can go out and interrogate what's there and kind of overcome this terror that people, I think, feel towards the unknown. Okay, so what does one actually teach? What should we teach? Well, at this point, let me give you a scenario. We have a design tutor sitting in the studio giving a tutorial to a student, and the conversation runs along, and they're talking about what the student's doing. And then at one point the tutor says, "Have you looked at the work of Krupp Himmelblau?" And the student says, "Who?" And the tutor says, "What? You mean you've never heard of Krupp Himmelblau?" I can't believe it. And clearly for this design tutor, Krupp Himmelblau is part of their own personal constellation of architecture. And then, he or she says, what do they teach you in history? Don't they teach you this stuff in history? What goes on there? And, utter disbelief at the apparent ineffectiveness of the history teaching in the school. Now, this scenario can run many times, and next week with another tutor, it'll be, Louis Barragan, or you know, another situation it'll be, I don't know, Beauvais Cathedral or something. And every time it turns out that the teachers of history have failed to deliver this particular iconic work which everybody should know about. How could you not know about Beauvais Cathedral? You know, it seems inconceivable to the tutor concerned that this ignorance could ever have occurred. Now, this clearly puts a rather heavy demand upon teachers of history. And of course, for anyone teaching a history program in the School of Architecture, it's impossible to satisfy this expectation of dozens of different design teachers, each of whom have their own particular kind of constellation of greats, which may depend upon their own intellectual formation, upon their education, upon, you know, particular preoccupations they have, which is perfectly understandable. But the difficulty is to expect that somehow a kind of formalized educational system can reproduce this many times over for many different people. It doesn't happen. So the answer is, well, one can't attempt to reproduce these many different and perfectly understandable obsessions that given individual design tutors have. And so what one teaches is in a way arbitrary. You teach some things that you're interested in, that you happen to think are important, and in a way it doesn't really matter, I think, very much what actually gets taught, provided that at the same time we also talk about why we've chosen to talk about those things, that there's some acknowledgement that this choice is, in a sense, arbitrary, that the making of choices in the selection of subject matter is something which is contentious, which gets debated, which people can have a point of view about, and so on. So that there's some recognition going on. It doesn't have to be done in a particularly heavy kind of way, but at least some passing recognition that the formation of a canon, if you like to call it that, is something which is always contested and disputed and changes all the time. So one takes account of that. You have to take account of that, I think, and that the actual selection of choices of things to teach at the end of the day is something which is provisional, and as I say, I don't think it really matters very much. I think at that point actually I'm going to stop, because that's as much as I think I can say about, you know, the general principles which guide me in thinking about how one might present a history of architecture to students of architecture and urbanism. Okay?
But I suppose, in thinking about it, the professionalization of architecture, the professionalization of the training, and the belief amongst historians of of architecture, that students must know a wider range of buildings than in some sense they could possibly experience directly, really introduces another layer into the picture, which is that in some sense the foundation of architecture schools and of historical programs to support that architectural training really introduces architectural history through a photographic archive, in a sense. So the problem is not just, inside the building, outside. It's the way in which architecture becomes a kind of archive of photographs, which I'm sure has consequences that we've never really kind of elucidated. I remember myself when I was at the Warburg Institute in the early 70s, they had a magnificent photographic library, largely of images which were there chosen because of their iconographic significance, that being the kind of center of the Institute's interests. But gradually, some younger teachers had raised the question, should the photographic library finally now become colored? And he moved to slides from black and white photographs. And there were some very distinguished and elderly scholars who said, absolutely not. I mean, color's extremely kind of confusing when you're trying to read the iconographical significance. And one very famous old iconographer said that he really wished the whole of Western art had been in black and white because it would have made it so much easier for the study of iconography. So could I mean, it's really to ask you, the fact is that in a direct way, our students won't, I think you're absolutely right. Last year I invited the second year just to go, you mentioned the Bloomsbury church. Here I always say go and look at the Elgin marbles. It turned out that about 3 of the whole 70 people in the second. Some people I berated and said, why didn't you go? They said, oh, I'm sorry, we couldn't find it. Excuse me, at least we how some of these people get home at night. And really what the Elgin marbles, like, well, obviously they are going to be returned. But at least at the moment you feel Greece ought to be allowed to kind of put them up as collateral. Like super prime mortgages. So really it's about the kind of mediation, which of course has now extended, into the computer.
No, well, interestingly, I remember a very similar discussion taking place in the Courtauld Institute, where I was a student at roughly the same time as Mark was a student at the, at roughly the same time that Mark was a student at the Warburg, about whether there should be colour slides or black and white. And there were indeed, I can confirm this, some who argued very strongly for the preservation of black and white as offering, in some sense, a truer representation of paintings in colour, which was really baffling. But what it brings up is the fact that whatever we do as teachers in the institution, we're dealing with surrogates. They are surrogates that we talk about. And there becomes the possibility that actually really what history is about is these surrogates for the objects. And there is, this is a tension which I think occurs in the teaching of the discipline, both within schools of architecture and within art history departments. What actually is it that the subject studies? Is it the representations of the objects or the objects themselves. And the objects themselves are actually much more difficult to study than the surrogates. So yes, this is part of the difficulty of what one teaches within the discipline. I've lost the thread of now what I was going to say. I've forgotten. Anyway, maybe, yeah, okay, let's have another question. Reinhold.
Reinhold. Sorry.
Yeah, no, maybe this is something like what you were thinking about, because the question of mediation does raise the question of the original. So I was wondering, okay, the interesting example that you gave of medical school and dissection seems to present the same problem, because these are dead bodies, so they're actually not studying the live human body in action, doing what it's supposed to be doing in order that they can experience directly and learn from directly the pursuit of their profession. These such fields also, they have this sort of associated practice of internship that seems to want to compensate for that. And architecture has its versions of that, the law has its versions of that. So in that sense, the kind of in the field out there doing the work, whether it's actually looking at buildings or practicing architecture while one is still a student in some form, seems to circle around the different levels of mediation. So I wonder what would happen if you removed the requirement for an original. Yeah, I think that what you just said kind of seems to go in that direction. If the expectation that there would be some core sort of object there were replaced by a circulatory model of different levels and types of mediation, including the bodies, the internship, the kind of setting of the internships and so on, what would result? I mean, it would return us to the question of what exactly do we teach when we teach, when we show a slide. But I'm curious what you think.
Well, I mean, maybe, yes, it's worth going back to the medical analogy, because what the student learns from the cadaver is anatomy. It's about the mechanics of the body. What they don't learn from it is about, as you say, the living organism. So physiology, the study of the living body, is dealt with in some other way. So they've made a separation in medical education between these two ways of understanding the body. And maybe there's some kind of equivalent that we have to think about in architectural education. Hadn't really occurred to me before. Maybe that's something which one might pursue. There are some more hands up. There's something else that you said, Reinhold, I'll pick up in a moment.
Just a slightly different take on that issue. I mean, I'm interested by the analogy or the scenario of the studio, and is it not what the design tutor wants is actually an intelligent conversation about the work? So saying, well, you don't know about Kopf-Himmelblau is not so much you haven't acquired the object, is that you can't have a discussion with me about a kind of the origin of your work. What the tutor seems to me would be happy with is, well, no, but what I am looking at is this, and I have made a relationship between this object and the work that I'm performing. So is it a question not so much about what objects are we teaching, but the acquisition of a language which can orientate students to a field, which we might show certain highlights within, but that they can move across that field and because they have a language to talk about the objects.
I mean, in a way that when you say where are you going, you don't follow it up by asking someone what they're going to look at.
I was going to maybe what you just mentioned was about the student's fear of the object is also that what we're talking about when we're talking about teaching history, in my case it's art history, but it is an encounter. And maybe what the student is frightened of is a certain kind of encounter. And also I wondered if you wanted to say something about time. I mean, given that we're talking about its past and we're raising this spectre of history as if history is one thing, and it's all that came up to this point, and that's what we're teaching, some kind of encounter with everything up to now. Whereas with the analogy with the medical student and the body, there is a kind of present. The body is present for them, their encounter with it is in the present, and yet it's a kind of former body. The thing they don't know is the history of that body unless they're reading the signs of it. But I suppose you could say, well, what you're teaching, if we're teaching through representations, is an encounter with various historical moments of documenting those buildings. Not as if those buildings have a continuous presence and we're showing snapshots of moments in that history. Surely what we can possibly teach is how to encounter, maybe thinking about sources, thinking about relative times in terms of different present moments as they're presented to us.
I'd agree with that. I mean, I'm trained as a historian, so I'm not sympathetic to the view that we live in a kind of eternal present and that objects are different things at different times. And so, I mean, certainly I believe that part of what the teaching of history should do is to expose how things change over the course of time. They become different things, and that a building designed today, therefore, is not always going to be what we suppose it to be now. So, I mean, I would... Sorry? Yes. But, what I suppose I remind people from time to time rather tediously is that history is about the past, but it's made in the present, and that what we're looking at is those many presents in which it has been made. Can I just respond actually to one other thing which occurred to me in relation to what Charles Rice was saying, and it's about the kind of catalogue of if you like, historical sources as a catalogue. That this seems to me to be the one thing which digital media has enormously simplified, that it is now possible very easily to find out what more or less any work in the world looks like, and often to find out some basic things about it. It seems to me there is no longer any excuse for anybody to remain in a position of ignorance about anything that might kind of come up in conversation. It's so easy to find out at least something about it. And this actually, I think, relieves a burden from the teacher of history, because traditionally one of the things that we said that we did was that we showed people how to find out about things, even if we didn't show them everything that there was there. At least we provided them with the means to discover things about it. And actually, I think we've been largely relieved of that obligation. It's so easy now for people to recover the kind of essential information. And I regard that as a liberation, actually.
I mean, I would accept that. But maybe the other side to that is that as a kind of information gathering device, and I'm not talking here about computer-aided design, as a kind of information gathering device, the computer is in some sense hostile to any critical awareness of the medium through which the information is delivered. That is to say, we have a long history in which architecture can be represented in drawing, in engraving, in other forms, and part of that knowledge is to know something about those medias and their consequences. And I think now that since they're all run into the singularity of the computer-generated image, we actually get less aware of the difference between media. So it's a sort of somewhat paradoxical point, because I think people think that the computer somehow is to do with media. But actually, it's possibly a force which stops us thinking about it.
Can I add? Oh,
yeah.
Sorry, I have the mic. Power. One more. No, to add one more kind of layer to this, about the supposed immediacy of the building itself. On the one hand, I have a colleague in art history who is building computer models of cathedrals, specifically in order to acquire a different sort of truth about these things. So in that sense, the computer model is thought to be more direct than the building itself. But what I'm interested in is sort of the other side of it, where the encounter with the object, even when any of us go there, is dissatisfying. It's in a sense inert. And I think that has, I think, enormous pedagogical value, because the expectation that of this sort of moment, the epiphany of arriving at the building and finally getting it, or finally appreciating the sort of timeless value of this thing, itself needs to be interrogated. That myth, essentially, of the direct encounter. So, I mean, I, for example, once took a group of architecture students to Rome, to go see Rome. They went to Rotterdam afterwards, because for them, Rotterdam was more Rome than Rome. And that was interesting, because I think that the disenchanted site or artifact has probably underdeveloped pedagogical value. Rome after Colin Rowe is in a way much more interesting to me than this, this sort of mystified, mythical fetish. So on the one hand, there's the phobia, and then there's the fetish, and somewhere in that economy, maybe there's something interesting. Anyway.
It reminds me of Goethe's visit to Paestum in, 1779 or something, and he made the then rather difficult journey to Paestum to see the ruined temples. And he got there, and he thought, God, this is an awful place. It's damp, it's humid, it's full of mosquitoes, the temples are all overgrown. Why have I come here? And then he says, I pulled myself together. I remembered my architectural history, and, it all kind of fell into place. But, yes, there is this question about what is the significance of the experience. What does that offer? Is it, overrated or underrated? I agree.
Concerning the prolixity, the abundance of the museum without walls, maybe one of the problems when the student knows that there are so many objects in the world and so many different cultures and so many examples, that in some way it becomes more important for them to be able to travel across them all, at least for a few years in youth, than to actually invest deeply in any one of them. And I think that was one reason why Kubler called his book Shapes of Time, because in a way he realized that as a historian his core interest was actually historical change, even more than the objects themselves. And I think that the intervention of the media, as Mark just said, obviously could sort of, as it were, supervene in that. But there is the point historically that there was a time, I think, when something like formalism, or the notion of significant form, seemed to suggest to some people, I suppose Fry and Bell, and maybe Kandinsky in a different way, that if only one could, as it were, read abstract form, that it was a kind of Esperanto of appreciation, that if we could just acquire this single faculty of being sensitive to significant form, that we could recognize it everywhere at all times in all objects. And I'm sure that that fantasy still lingers around in some way, and that we've not quite overcome it.
When I was a first-year student of architecture, I was sent to the library to check up on history, and history took the form of a single book, Bannister Fletcher's History of Architecture by the Comparative Method. Very few photographs, none of them colored, very few perspectives, abundance of architecture in plan, section, elevation. In other words, it was a history of architecture on the mechanics of how you represent architecture. So my question for Adrian is, what would be the equivalent of that, Bannister Fletcher then, to the digital age today?
It's a very good question, that. And I think one of the things, and I've had to think about this, is one of the things that it should be able to do is in somehow to represent or include something about the situation, citing the culture in which those objects are, which is possible through digital media in a way that wasn't available to Bannister Fletcher, so that it's possible to give a kind of additional depth, if you will, breadth to the image. That's my initial thought, I think.
Maybe just the beginning of a conversation that I hope to continue also in my presentation later, but I suppose that it seems that our sort of the reading of architectural history is very much pegged on objects. No? I mean, we can kind of return again and again to the object, where I wonder if a kind of a break from the frame of architectural history that somehow seemed to be what is proposed here is also seeing the kind of or reading history through the object as a sort of a set of unfolding relations between objects, people, practices, institutions, etc., that kind of open up the reading from one which is always returning to and coming out of the object. It's kind of a reading of object. And I wonder if that is in any way something that could challenge, you think, sort of the way in which architectural history is organized.
Well, there's, the paradox that what schools of architecture don't teach is buildings. That it teaches people how to make images and representations, and that the building is not, by and large, something which is part of architectural education. And that, certainly contributes to this fixation on the image as being the object of study rather than the object. Nonetheless, to me, what's interesting about, cities in the world is that, they are capable of bearing thoughts. And, people have been using them to do that for a long time. And that, to me, is the thing that's rather wonderful about them. And that's why I think that it's worth studying objects rather than representations of objects. I wouldn't exclude the representation, but the object to me remains the thing which ultimately we're concerned with.
I want to return to the representation, because in one way, students nowadays travel more than ever, and I think this superfluous kind of accessibility of images just generate even more desire to go and search out those images. In some way that you want to have this encounter with a real object, but it's also, of course, already a representation when you come there. So I think in some way, I don't really recognize the image of this enclose students. It's rather that they want to kind of, travel the world, search out those images, finding the image in some way when they reach there. Maybe that's the disappointment. This kind of works half. It wasn't really a question. It was more a reflection.
Yeah. And Tortoise's question is the superabundance of images causes us to see the building as a kind of secondary effect in relation to the multiplicity of images. Yeah, which is certainly true. And yeah, one has to be kind of knowing about that, I think, when you deal with objects. They have been sometimes pushed into that secondary position, I think. I agree.
Okay, there's maybe a last question.
I just want to just dwell a little bit on the last point that Reinhold made about the myth of the direct encounter, because I feel like it has a correspondence to another myth, which is the myth that to kind of understand the city and architecture, one has to know something about it. And I guess I kind of, for me, that kind of feels like it's the kind of constitutional myth or the kind of axiom that from which was derived the way that I was taught history, such that you have to know something about it before you can start to kind of understand it, and that kind of circumscribes a certain way of us kind of thinking about and talking about architecture. That I guess for me, what's at stake in that, though, is the kind of public life of the architect and architecture. If we think that one needs to have a kind of historical apparatus to actually be able to interact with that building. Because I guess I just don't think that one needs to know, that a column with a hat, with a beam and another hat, has a historical idea of order. I think one can kind of understand that it does kind of stand for order. Or that a public space can be a kind of a public space based on the way that it's used, or the way that glass kind of has a transparency. I feel like there are kind of ways that people, the lay public that's not kind of educated architecturally, can understand the built environment, such that when you sit in a studio crit and your critic says, do you know this Coupe Himmelbau building? My direct encounter with that kind of crit, which I've had, is such that in the end what you end up with presenting is a kind of network of kind of historical artifacts that then kind of act as the kind of historical understanding of your project when you present it at the end, that stands in for a kind of other analysis of the building, one that could actually allow you to kind of have to participate in a kind of public sphere.
I mean, I think the proposition that we're faced with is that kind of series of historical references is no longer necessary in the presentation of architectural projects, that maybe that is over. That's not something that's called for anymore, which is quite possible. I don't have a view about that. I think the other point I would make is that, to me, history is only one way of knowing about architecture. I wouldn't make any claims for it as being the only way of thinking about architecture. There are lots of other ways in which one can formulate, thoughts and arguments about architecture. It happens to be one that contains quite a lot of stuff, and so is fairly kind of rich in opportunities. But I don't see it as having any particular right to monopolize architectural discourse. But, I'd still hold for it having, there are some reasons why I still think it's worth thinking about it and employing it in certain situations.